The Pigeon River was running high the day Silas Greer came down the muddy church road with a jug of corn whiskey in one hand, and his two barefoot daughters trailing behind him like wild kittens. He had not meant to stop at the church. He had not been inside that building since the day they put his wife Mary in the cold ground 3 winters back. But the twins had seen the crowd spilling out the front doors, and Ruby had grabbed his pant leg, and Pearl had pointed her small dirty finger at a woman lying in the wet road. And that was the moment everything in Silas Greer's quiet bitter life began to crack open. The woman was soaked clean through. Her dress, what had once been a brown calico, was now the color of wet bark, and the hem was black with mud. Her hair was cropped short and growing back in uneven tufts, the kind of haircut a jail matron gives a woman with a pair of dull shears. A hymnal lay open in the mud near her hand. Another had struck her square on the cheekbone and left a red welt that was already turning purple. She was not crying. She was not moving. She was lying there with her eyes half open, staring up at the iron-gray sky like she had decided to let the rain bury her where she lay. Pearl let go of Silas's pant leg and walked straight up to the woman. Ruby followed. The two girls knelt in the mud on either side of her, and Pearl, who was the bolder of the twins by about 30 seconds and 3 pounds, reached down and touched the woman's cheek with one filthy finger. The woman's eyes focused. Pearl looked up at her father. "Daddy," she said, in the small, clear voice she used for important things, "can we keep her? She smells like soap." Silas Greer set down the jug. The late autumn of 1893 had come down on the Smokies like a hammer on a tin roof, and the first ice storm was already 2 days late. Somewhere up the hollow, a tree branch cracked like a rifle shot. The Pigeon River, swollen and dark, hummed against its banks. A scandal was being born in Greer Hollow that morning, and the unforgiving mountain folk of eastern Tennessee would not forget it for as long as the river ran. Her name was Hannah Whitfield, and 4 months earlier she had been the most talked-about woman in Knox County. She was 26 years old. She had grown up the youngest of 7 on a hardscrabble farm above the French Broad, and she had married Caleb Whitfield the summer she turned 19 because her father told her to, and because Caleb owned 400 acres of virgin timber land on the south face of Greer Mountain. The land had been deeded to Caleb by his own father in 1885, signed and witnessed at the Sevierville courthouse, and it was the only thing in Caleb Whitfield's life that was worth more than the whiskey he drank. Caleb had been a mean drunk and a meaner husband. Hannah carried the bruises under her sleeves and the broken places in her ribs, and she did not speak of them, because in 1893 in the Tennessee mountains, a woman did not speak of such things. She just kept the cornbread warm and the fire stoked and her eyes on the floor. Then one cold March night Caleb came home from the still, drank a tin cup of something that did not agree with him, and died on the kitchen floor with foam at the corners of his mouth. The constable came, the doctor came, the doctor said it was poison. The constable said it was Hannah. She spent 4 months in the Knoxville jail awaiting trial. She slept on a straw tick in a stone cell with 2 other women, and the matron sheared her hair off the first week because of lice. When the trial finally came, the jury could not find a single witness who had seen her buy poison, prepare poison, or administer poison. The judge banged his gavel and declared her acquitted, and Hannah Whitfield walked out of the Knox County courthouse into a world that had already decided she was guilty. She walked the 10 miles back to the Whitfield farm in a borrowed dress with a tin locket clutched in her fist. The locket held a pressed sprig of mountain laurel from her wedding day, and it was the only thing she had left in the world. When she reached the farm, her father-in-law Ezra Whitfield met her on the porch with a shotgun across his arms. "There is no place for you here, girl," Ezra said. "The land is being handled. Preacher Thorne is seeing to it. Go on now. Go anywhere but here." The land is being handled. She did not understand those words then. She would understand them later. But that day she only nodded, and she turned, and she walked back down the rutted wagon road toward town with the locket warming in her fist. She slept that first night in a corn crib, the second night in a hay barn, the third night under the eaves of a stranger's smokehouse, and on the fourth morning, which was a Sunday, she walked up the muddy road to Greer Hollow Baptist Church because she had heard the women laid out dinner on the lawn after the service, and she had not eaten in 2 days. She slipped into the back pew. She kept her head down. She folded her hands in her lap and she tried very hard to be small. Preacher Elias Thorne saw her from the pulpit before the first hymn was finished. Preacher Thorne was a tall, narrow man with a mustache the color of iron filings and eyes the color of wet slate. He had been the spiritual authority in Greer Hollow for 19 years, and he was a man much beloved by the timber merchants who came up from Knoxville to do business in the valley. He stopped his sermon mid-sentence. He pointed one long, bony finger down the aisle. "There is a serpent in this house of the Lord," he said, in a voice that carried clear to the rafters. "There is a woman in this sanctuary whose hands are red with the blood of her own lawful husband. The Knox County Court may have failed in its duty, but the Lord God Almighty does not fail. Sister Whitfield, you will rise. You will leave this house. You will not pollute it further with your presence." Hannah rose. Her legs were shaking. She did not look up. She had taken 3 steps toward the door when the first hymnal struck her shoulder. The second struck her cheekbone. She did not know who threw them. She did not look back. She walked out of the church and down the steps and into the freezing rain that had begun to fall while the preacher preached, and she walked 20 paces down the road, and then her knees went out from under her, and she lay down in the mud and she stopped trying. She was not crying. She had used up all her crying in the jail. She was just done. That was when 2 small barefoot girls came around the bend in the road, and one of them looked up at the largest, dirtiest, most terrifying man Hannah had ever seen, and asked if they could keep her. Silas Greer was 34 years old and looked 50. He stood 6 feet and 3 inches in his stockinged feet, which he rarely was, and he had the shoulders of a man who had split his own firewood every winter since he was 9. His beard was black shot with premature gray. His eyes were the color of river slate. He smelled, on that particular morning, of corn mash, pine smoke, and the wet wool of his hunting coat. His wife Mary had died on the kitchen table of his stone and log cabin 3 years back, bringing the twins into the world. The town doctor, Dr. Prout, had been sent for at the first contraction. The doctor had been sitting in Preacher Thorne's parlor drinking sherry, and he had decided the weather was too poor to ride up the hollow. Mary had bled out at 4 in the morning with the twins squalling in a basket beside her cooling body, and Silas had ridden down the mountain at dawn and broken 3 of Dr. Prout's teeth with one swing of his fist. He had not been back to town for anything but salt and cartridges in 3 years. His daughters Ruby and Pearl were 6 years old. They wore dresses he had stitched himself from old flour sacks, which is to say poorly. Their hair had not been brushed in months. They spoke in half-finished sentences and ran like deer through the laurel hells, and they were the only 2 living things in the world that Silas Greer would have walked through fire for. He looked down at the woman in the road. He looked at his daughters kneeling beside her. He looked at the hymnal in the mud and the welt on her cheek, and he understood without anyone telling him what had happened in the church behind him. He had read about her in the Knoxville paper, Hannah Whitfield, acquitted but disgraced. The whole valley had been talking about it for a month. "Get up off the ground, girls," he said. His voice was low and rough as river gravel. Ruby did not move. She had taken her thin shawl off her own small shoulders and was carefully arranging it over Hannah's chest. Pearl was holding something in her closed fist that she had not been holding a minute before. "Daddy," Pearl said again, looking up at him with absolute conviction, "can we keep her? She smells like soap." Silas crouched down. His knees popped. He looked at Hannah Whitfield, and Hannah Whitfield looked back at him, and what he saw in her eyes was the exact same emptiness he had seen in his own face in the cracked, shaving mirror the morning after Mary died. "Ma'am," he said, "can you stand?" "No," she whispered. "Did they hurt you bad?" "No worse than I've been hurt before." Silas grunted. He looked at Pearl. "What's that in your hand, child?" Pearl opened her fist. A small tarnished tin locket lay in her palm, the size of a thumbnail, with a tiny dried sprig of mountain laurel pressed inside the open clasp. "She give it to me," Pearl said. "She said it was for keeping safe." Silas looked at Hannah. "That all you got in the world, ma'am?" "Yes." "And you give it to my child?" She was cold. He stared at her a long moment. Behind him, the church doors were opening. He could hear the murmur of the congregation gathering on the steps to watch the spectacle. He could feel Preacher Thorne's slate-gray eyes on the back of his neck. Silas Greer had not made a decision that mattered in 3 years. He made one now. He slid one arm under Hannah's knees and one arm under her shoulders, and he stood up with her like she weighed no more than a sack of cornmeal. She made a small sound in her throat, half protest, half relief. "Ruby, Pearl, get the jug." The twins scrambled. He turned around with Hannah Whitfield in his arms, and he started walking toward the church steps, because his mule was tied to the hitching post on the far side of the yard, and there was no other way to get to it. Preacher Elias Thorne was waiting at the bottom of the church steps with Constable Wade Hollister at his elbow. Constable Hollister was a soft, round man with a tin star pinned crooked on his vest, and a face that had never made a decision Preacher Thorne had not approved of first. "Silas Greer," the preacher's voice was the same one he used from the pulpit, "set that woman down." Silas did not stop walking. "That woman is a murderess. The court of man may have freed her, but the court of the Lord." "Move, preacher." "I will not. Constable Hollister, do your duty." Constable Hollister put a hand on the butt of his revolver. He did not draw it. He looked at the size of Silas Greer's shoulders, and he looked at the squirrel rifle slung across Silas Greer's back, and he found that his hand had developed a tremor. Behind the preacher, the congregation had gathered in a tight, scandalized knot on the church steps. Ezra Whitfield was there. Dr. Prout was there, 2 teeth still missing from his upper jaw. Old Mrs. Hollister, the constable's mother, had her hand pressed to her mouth in performance of horror. Silas stopped 6 feet from the preacher. He did not set Hannah down. "Preacher," he said, quiet, "I've been sober when I rode down this road this morning, and I've been sober for 19 days running, and I would like to stay sober. So I am going to say this one time. This woman is coming home with me. You and your church and your good God-fearing flock have done your day's work. You can go on inside and pray on it. You cannot harbor a confessed. She didn't confess to nothing. The court let her go." "The land of her late husband," Preacher Thorne said, and his voice changed just slightly, dropped half a register, "is a matter being handled by this church as executor of the Whitfield estate. If you take this woman, Silas Greer, you are interfering in a legal—" "The land," Hannah said. Both men looked at her. She was staring at the preacher over Silas's shoulder, and for the first time that morning her eyes were not empty. They were sharp. "What about the land, preacher?" she whispered. Preacher Thorne's mouth closed. He had said one word too many, and he knew it, and Silas saw him know it. Silas Greer smiled for the first time in 3 years. It was not a pleasant smile. "Step aside, preacher," he said. Preacher Thorne stepped aside. Silas walked past him to the hitching post. He set Hannah up on the mule's broad back as gentle as setting down a sleeping child. He lifted Ruby up in front of her and Pearl up behind, and he took the lead rope in his hand, and he walked his small, strange caravan straight through the parted congregation without looking at any of them, and he led them up the road toward Greer Hollow as the freezing rain began to turn to sleet. Behind him, on the church steps, Preacher Elias Thorne stood very still and watched them go. Then he turned to Constable Hollister, and in a voice nobody else could hear he said, "Ride to Knoxville tonight. Tell Mr. Crail we have a problem." The cabin at the head of Greer Hollow was set against a granite shoulder of the mountain, 2 stories of stone and notched chestnut logs, with a stone chimney wide enough for a grown man to stand inside. A spring ran out of the cliff behind the cabin and down through a hollowed log trough into a stone basin in the kitchen. The smell of the place was wood smoke and cured ham, and the faint, sweet ghost of corn mashed from the still, hidden in the laurel a 1/4 mile up the holler. Silas put Hannah in the bed that had been Mary's. He did not say whose bed it had been. He fed her cornbread soaked in pot liquor because that was all her stomach could hold. He sent the twins up the loft ladder to sleep, and he sat by the fire in his hickory chair with the squirrel rifle across his knees, and he watched the door until the gray dawn came up over the ridge. Hannah slept 18 hours straight. She woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of 2 small girls fighting in whispers over who got to feed the goat. That was the first day. On the third day, she got out of bed and walked, on legs that shook, to the kitchen, and she sat on a stool and she taught Ruby how to braid Pearl's hair. Pearl howled. Ruby was patient. By the end of the lesson, both girls had a single uneven braid down their backs, and Pearl had stopped howling and started giggling, and Silas stood in the doorway with an armload of stovewood and watched, and the muscle in his jaw worked the way it did when he was trying not to feel something. On the 7th day, Hannah scrubbed the stone hearth with lye and sand until it came up the color of new bread. On the 10th day, she baked her first pan of cornbread in the covered skillet, and Silas ate 3 squares of it without speaking, and then a fourth. And then he got up and walked outside and split firewood for 2 hours without his coat on. On the 14th day, while she was washing the breakfast tins in the stone basin, Hannah began to hum. She did not know she was doing it. The tune came up out of her the way water comes up out of a spring without permission. It was "Shall We Gather at the River." It was the hymn the congregation had been singing the morning the hymnals flew. Silas was at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle. His hand stopped. Hannah heard the silence and turned around. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Don't stop," he said. She looked at him. "It's a good song," he said, looking down at the rifle. "Mary used to hum it." She hummed the rest of the verse. He cleaned the rifle. Ruby and Pearl came in from the porch with their hair full of dry leaves and asked what was for dinner. That night, lying on his cot by the fire, Silas Greer realized 2 things. The first was that he had not had a drink of whiskey in 23 days. The second was that the cracked, locked-up place behind his ribs where Mary used to live had quietly, without his permission, begun to make room for somebody else. He turned over and faced the wall, and he tried very hard not to think about it. The ice storm came 3 days later. It came in the night, and it came hard. Silas woke to the sound of trees cracking up on the ridge like rifle volleys. By dawn, the whole hollow was glazed in a half-inch of clear ice, and the laurel branches hung down to the ground under the weight of it, and the Pigeon River was running black and high and mean with sleet melt off the higher country. Silas had 2 wagon loads of cured chestnut down at the river road that he had promised to deliver to a sawyer named Holcomb that very morning. The money from that timber was meant to put the twins in proper shoes before winter. He stood on the porch in the gray dawn and looked at the ice on every twig and branch, and he weighed his options. "I have to go," he said. Hannah was at the hearth stirring grits today. "Holcomb won't wait. He's got a contract out of Asheville." The bridge will hold. I crossed it in worse." She did not argue. She had learned in 26 years that arguing with a mountain man about weather was a waste of breath. She wrapped a cold biscuit and 2 strips of bacon in a square of cloth and pressed it into his hand. She did not look at him when she did it. "Bar the door behind me," he said. "Both bars. Don't open it for nobody but me. And I'll whistle 3 times so you know." "All right." "Hannah." She looked up. "If something happens, if I don't come back by dark, the squirrel rifle is loaded. The shells are in the tin on the mantel. You point it and you pull the trigger and you don't think twice." She nodded once. He went. The morning passed slow. Hannah baked. The twins played at being preachers, which involved Pearl standing on a stump in the yard shaking her finger at a chicken while Ruby threw acorns at her. Hannah hummed "Shall We Gather at the River" without thinking about it, and she did not notice that the temperature was falling, and she did not notice the second wave of sleet coming down the ridge until the light in the windows had gone the color of pewter. She was just calling the twins inside when she heard the boots on the porch. They were not Silas's boots. Silas's boots were heavy and even. These boots were uneven, dragging, 1 foot heavier than the other, and there was no whistle. Hannah went very still. "Get to the loft," she said quietly to the girls. "Right now, don't make a sound." Ruby went up the ladder like a squirrel. Pearl froze. Hannah lifted her bodily and pushed her up the rungs. "Hide under the bare pelt. Do not come down, do not make a noise. Whatever you hear, you stay quiet." She walked to the door. The squirrel rifle was on the pegs above it. She took it down and she checked the load the way Silas had shown her, and she stood with the muzzle pointed at the door. The knock came hard, 3 blows. "Mrs. Whitfield." The voice was wet and low and sounded like it had been left out in the rain. "I know you're in there. Open the door." She did not answer. "Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Roland Crail. I am a land surveyor out of Knoxville. I work for Mr. Asher Pennington, who has a lawful interest in the Whitfield acreage. I have come a long way in poor weather. Open the door and we will conduct our business like civilized people." She did not answer. There was a pause. Then the doorknob turned and rattled. Then there was a heavy thump as a shoulder hit the door, and another and then a third, and the upper bar held but the lower bar splintered out of its bracket with a crack like a breaking bone. The door swung inward. Roland Crail stepped through it. He was a tall, narrow man in a long, wet oilcloth coat. His left coat sleeve was pinned up at the shoulder where the arm should have been. His right hand held a heavy black revolver. His teeth were stained brown from tobacco, and one of his front teeth was gone. He stepped inside and he saw Hannah standing in the middle of the kitchen with a squirrel rifle leveled at his chest, and he smiled. "Mrs. Whitfield, put that down before you hurt yourself." "Get out of my house." "It is not your house, ma'am, and in about 10 minutes' time it is not going to be the Greer house either." "I will shoot you." "You will not." He took a slow step forward. "Because you have never shot a man in your life and you do not have it in you. And because if you pull that trigger, my associate down at the foot of the holler will hear it and he will come up here, and he will not be as polite as I am." He took another step. "I want the box, Mrs. Whitfield. The tin box your late husband buried. The ledger. You give it to me and I ride out of this hollow and you never see me again." "I don't know what box you're talking about." "You do." "I don't." His good hand came up. The pistol came up with it, not pointed at her. Pointed at the loft. "I can hear those children breathing, Mrs. Whitfield. I can hear them from here, so we are going to try this again. The box, the ledger, now." Hannah Whitfield, who had not raised her voice in jail, who had not raised her voice when the hymnals struck her, who had not raised her voice when her father-in-law turned her off the porch with a shotgun, found her voice now, and it was the quietest thing in the world. "Tell me about the box first," she said, "and I will get it." He laughed. He thought he had one. "Your husband Caleb was a drunk and a fool, but he was not a complete idiot. He kept a ledger. Names, dates, the price per acre Preacher Thorne offered him to forge his own father's will. Old man Whitfield never meant for that timber to go to a Knoxville baron. He meant it for his grandchildren. Caleb signed the forgery. The preacher witnessed it. Then Caleb got drunk one night and told his wife about it, and the wife started asking questions, and the preacher decided the wife had to go. A little arsenic in the corn liquor and a frame-up at the courthouse, and the whole problem solves itself. Except the wife didn't hang, and the ledger never turned up." He smiled again. "Where is it, Mrs. Whitfield?" Hannah lowered the squirrel rifle. She set it down very gently on the kitchen table because she had understood something in the last 30 seconds. The squirrel rifle held a single shot. He held 6, and he was between her and the loft. She turned her back on him, slow, and she walked 3 steps to the cutting block by the hearth, where her butcher's cleaver lay next to the cast-iron skillet that still had the morning's bacon grease congealing in it. And as she walked she began, very softly, to hum. "Shall we gather at the river?" "What in God's name are you doing?" Roland Crale said. The beautiful river." She picked up the skillet. She turned around. She threw the skillet underhand the way her brothers had taught her to throw a horseshoe, and 4 pounds of hot cast iron caught Roland Crale flush across the bridge of the nose. The revolver went off into the ceiling. Sawdust rained down. Pearl screamed in the loft. Hannah grabbed the cleaver off the block. Crale staggered back against the door frame, blood pouring out of his nose and into his mouth, and he brought the pistol up again, and Hannah came across the kitchen with the cleaver raised, and at the exact moment he steadied the pistol on her chest, the cabin door behind him exploded inward off its remaining hinge. Silas Greer came through the doorway. He was soaking wet. His coat was gone. His shirt was torn at the shoulder and there was blood running down his temple, and his beard was rimed with ice. He had an axe in his right hand and pure mountain fury in his eyes, and he had crawled the last mile up the holler on his hands and knees after the footbridge went into the river underneath him. Roland Crale turned. He got the pistol halfway around. Silas Greer hit him once across the side of the head with the flat of the axe. Roland Crale did not get up. The cabin went very quiet. The only sound was the sleet on the roof and Pearl whimpering in the loft and Hannah's breath coming in ragged pulls. Silas dropped the axe. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and his arms went around Hannah, and the cleaver fell out of her hand and clattered on the floor, and he held her against his chest the way a man holds the one thing he was sure he had lost, and she felt the shake go through his whole big frame. "I thought," he said into her hair, "Hannah, I thought." "I know. The river took the bridge. I went in. I thought I wasn't going to make it back up the hollow. I thought I could hear." "I know, Silas." 2 small bodies came down the loft ladder so fast Ruby missed the bottom rung and landed in a heap. Pearl was already running. They hit Silas and Hannah at knee height and wrapped themselves around whatever piece of leg or skirt they could reach, and the 4 of them stood there in the wrecked kitchen, on the splintered floorboards, with Roland Crale unconscious at their feet, and they held on to each other. Silas Greer, who had not wept since the morning Mary died, put his face down in Hannah's cropped uneven hair and wept. He bound Roland Crale hand and foot with baling wire and threw him in the smokehouse to thaw and to think. He stoked the fire. He hung his wet clothes on the line by the hearth. He stripped to the waist and let Hannah wash the cut on his temple with hot water and witch hazel, and he sat very still under her hands, and he did not look at her face, because if he looked at her face, he was going to do something he was not yet ready to do. In the morning the ice storm had passed, and the sun came up hard and bright over the ridge, and the whole hollow glittered like cut glass. Silas did not ride to Constable Hollister. He hitched the mule to the wagon and loaded Roland Crale in the bed like a sack of feed, and he put Hannah on the wagon seat beside him with a wool blanket across her lap, and he sent the twins to stay with old Widow Calloway 2 miles down the river road, and he drove the wagon 46 miles east to Knoxville, to the federal courthouse, where the circuit judge for the Eastern District was holding the autumn term. Roland Crale, sober and frightened, and looking at a federal charge of attempted murder and conspiracy to defraud, sang for the judge for 2 solid hours. He named Preacher Elias Thorne. He named Constable Wade Hollister. He named the Knoxville timber baron Asher Pennington, who had paid $800 in bribes for the forging of one old man's will. He named the date the arsenic had been delivered to the preacher's parsonage, and the name of the apothecary who had sold it. The judge listened, the judge wrote, the judge issued warrants. On a Sunday 3 weeks later, two federal marshals walked into Greer Hollow Baptist Church in the middle of the 11 o'clock service. Preacher Elias Thorne was in the middle of a sermon on the wages of sin. The marshals walked up the center aisle. They took him off the pulpit in irons. Constable Wade Hollister tried to slip out the side door and was caught in the cemetery and arrested among the headstones. Dr. Prout was not charged but was named in the proceedings, and within a month he had sold his practice and moved to Chattanooga, and Greer Hollow never saw him again. The federal court restored the 400 acres of Whitfield timberland to Hannah Whitfield, sole heir of the lawful estate, and awarded her 3 years of back rents at fair market rate, which came to a sum of money larger than anyone in Greer Hollow had ever held in their 2 hands at the same time. A week after the ruling, a man in a fine wool suit and a curled mustache rode up the wagon road to Greer Hollow in a hired carriage. His name was Mr. Linwood Bell, and he was the wealthiest lumber merchant in Knoxville, and he had read about Hannah Whitfield in the Knoxville Daily Journal, and he had come, he said, to make her an offer of marriage and a house on Gay Street with 3 servants and a piano in the parlor. Hannah came out onto the porch. She had Pearl on her hip. Ruby was holding the hem of her skirt. A pan of cornbread was cooling on the porch rail in the late autumn sun. Down in the yard, Silas Greer was splitting kindling for the winter, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbow, the axe rising and falling in an easy rhythm. He had not looked up when the carriage came up the road, because he had already decided he was not going to make this decision for her. Mr. Linwood Bell made his speech. It was a fine speech. He had clearly worked on it. Hannah listened all the way through, because she had been raised to be polite. When he was done, she set Pearl down on the porch boards, and she folded her hands in front of her apron, and she looked Mr. Linwood Bell in the eye. "Mr. Bell," she said, "I thank you for the ride out and for your kind words, but I have been hungry and I have been cold and I have been alone, and I have lived in a town and I have lived in a jail and I have lived in this hollow, and I have learned the difference between a house and a home. I am already home, sir. I am sorry you came so far." Mr. Linwood Bell took it like a gentleman. He tipped his hat. He rode back down the wagon road. Hannah watched the carriage disappear around the bend. Down in the yard, Silas Greer set down the axe. He picked up an armload of split kindling. He came up the porch steps slow, and he stopped at the top step and he looked at her. "You sure?" he said. "I am sure, Silas." He nodded once. He set the kindling down by the door. He held out his hand, palm up, the way a man might to a wild thing he was not certain would come to him. Hannah Whitfield put her hand in his. Down in the bottom of the hollow, the Pigeon River hummed along its banks, the same low, steady sound it had been humming when she lay in the mud outside the church a lifetime ago. From the open kitchen door came the smell of cornbread cooling. Pearl was singing some made-up song to a beetle on the porch rail. Ruby was already pulling at Silas's pant leg, asking when supper would be. The 4 of them stood there on the porch in the late autumn light. The mountain man, the 2 wild barefoot girls, and the woman the whole valley had thrown away. A family forged in mud and ice, and the strange, stubborn grace of 2 children who knew what the grown folks did not, that the soul of a person can be smelled like soap on the wind, if you are small enough and clean enough of heart to know what you are smelling for. Did you see the preacher's twist coming, or did it slip past you the way it slipped past Hannah? If this story warmed something in you, hit that like button. Share it with somebody who needs to hear that the rejected ones are sometimes the only ones with anything real to give. And subscribe for more true-to-life tales from the deep hollows and high ridges of the American frontier. We have a story coming next week you are not going to want to miss.